A legend among legends, a priceless Hollywood gem, and a unique icon that the world might never see again is Sylvester Stallone. He is a living example of how suffering can be transformed into glory and hopelessness into immortality. He overcame adversity, rejection, ridicule, brokenness, and contempt. Nevertheless, he rose like a storm, transforming his wounded soul into Rocky Balboa, his broken voice into defiance, and his battered body into steel. A hero who became America's lifeblood. From Rambo's ruthless jungles to Rocky's Oscar stage, from Hollywood's roaring thunder to the heartbreaking silence following the death of his cherished son, dreams, suffering, and legacy have all been burdened by Stallone, and he has never allowed them to fall. He changed more than just the movie industry. He reinterpreted what it meant to fight, to persevere, to get back up after every setback life throws at you. And now, with a name permanently inscribed in Hollywood history and a personal fortune exceeding $400 million, the harsh reality is this. The scars left by time, surgery, loss, and aging itself cannot be healed by fame, money, or praise. Sylvester Stallone is no longer battling for applause at the age of 79. He is up against a more vicious opponent than any role he has ever portrayed. As a lasting homage to this unique Hollywood gem, let your like shine and leave a heart in the comments if you think Sylvester Stallone is not just an actor, but also a real legend of tenacity. Sylvester Stallone's life tragedy did not wait for him to mature. It happened right when he was born. Michael Sylvester Gardenzio Stallone was born on July 6, 1946, in the harsh streets of Hell's Kitchen, New York, not with happiness but with suffering. His left side of his mouth was paralyzed after a forceps delivery went horribly wrong, tearing into the sensitive nerves of his face. At first, the slurred speech and crooked smile that would one day make him famous were a cruel sentence, a sign of brokenness, a mark of difference. His first breath was a warning rather than a beginning. Life would not be simple. Even as a newborn, fate seemed to be whispering that his journey would be one of hardship and unhealing wounds. What started out as a birth tragedy would turn into his deepest scar and his most defining characteristic. There was no safety in his family. His father, Italian immigrant barber Frank Stallone Sr., was a fiery man who ruled with fear rather than compassion. He was strict, erratic, and quick with his fists. Jackie, his eccentric and restless mother, frequently left her sons to fend for themselves because she was preoccupied with astrology and her own goals. Their house was a battleground rather than a haven. Voices raised in anger, doors slamming, and a silence so icy it sliced like glass. Later on, Stallone would admit, "I never knew what a happy home was." This straightforward admission encapsulated years of confusion and emptiness. The family relocated to Maryland when he was 5 years old, but the chaos followed them like a plague. He and his younger brother, Frank Jr., were caught between abandonment and rage as pawns in their parents' never-ending battle. Stallone's parents separated in 1957 when he was just 11 years old. In an attempt to finally fit in, he chased his mother to Philadelphia while clinging to her, hungry for love. The courts instead forced him to return to his father, where punishment meant cruelty rather than direction. His youthful heart broke once more. Instead of being a sanctuary, school turned into yet another place of humiliation. Slant-Mouth Sylvia and Mr. Potato Head were among the ruthless jeers directed at his crooked mouth and slurred voice. Every moniker pierced his soul like a blade, causing him to feel ashamed. He was weak physically, rickets weakened with thin limbs and hollow eyes. Thus he was disregarded, written off as a weak, unworthy boy who showed no promise. 13 schools expelled him, each one feeling like a door being slammed in his face. At last, he was transferred to Devereux Manor, a reform center where damaged kids were kept like hopeless cases. He was labeled a boy destined for a bad fate by his teachers, a prophecy that was both suffocating and cruel. Even at home, his mother's harsh, unforgiving words reverberated in his ears, giving him the terrifying impression that his very being was undesirable. For most people, childhood is a time of innocence. It was a never-ending storm of rejection for Sylvester, and yet he detected a single glimmer of light in this gloom. Young Stallone found the one place the world could not touch him in the dark: smoke-filled theaters of New York. He would spend hours sitting by himself in the back row, losing himself in the stories of heroes who came from nothing, the projector's light flickering across his scarred face. Men triumphed in impossible battles on screen, saving others when no one else had saved them. He later recalled, "I would spend untold hours in theaters. Most people thought of movies as entertainment, That was the life I wanted. Triumph over evil. A hero who saved people. For Stallone, they represented survival, oxygen, and evidence that even the damaged could achieve extraordinary things. Every taunt he received, every lonely night, and every harsh remark from his parents made him more defiant rather than hopeless. Rocky Balboa's distinctive gravelly voice would eventually replace the very slur that made him a laughingstock. His desire to motivate millions would be fueled by the loneliness that almost broke him. His early years were not kind. It was a trial by fire, a crucible. He persevered despite all odds, bearing scars that would eventually serve as the foundation for his legend. He didn't start his acting career with bright lights and red carpets. Day after day, the cold steel of rejection pressed against him, and it started with hunger and loneliness. After studying in Switzerland, Stallone returned to the United States and enrolled at the University of Miami to pursue a career in theater and drama. His restless fire, however, was too strong for the classroom. With only a few dollars, a coat that served as a blanket, and an unattainable dream, he left and got on a bus headed for New York City. It was said that dreams were made in New York. For Stallone, it turned into a battleground where he had to fight every day just to survive. Clutching his headshot, he walked the city like a ghost, knocking on casting agency doors and pleading for a chance. The response was consistently the same: "No, not you." They said his voice was too slurred, his face was incorrect, and his appearance was too odd. Some agents asked if he had a speech impediment and laughed out loud. Others didn't even look up as they pushed his pictures back across the desk. Every rejection felt like a new blade cutting into childhood wounds that had never completely healed. But in spite of the humiliation, he persisted. His coat served as his only home for 3 endless weeks while he slept on iron benches in the Port Authority bus terminal. He used public restrooms to take a shower, ate scraps when he could find them, and bore the long nights when his hunger tore at him more loudly than any applause he could imagine. He had to make decisions that no one with a dream should ever have to make out of desperation, which led him to accept work that embarrassed him. He later admitted, "I had to do what I could to survive because I was starving and had no money." He took on every strange task the city gave him in order to survive, including ushering at theaters, selling tickets, cleaning cages at the Central Park Zoo, and even cleaning lion cages at the Bronx Zoo. Every job had the same conclusion: another door closed, another firing. The world seemed to be working against him, reminding him of the labels he had carried since he was a child: unworthy, unwanted, and hopeless. However, the seeds of greatness were subtly germinating within the rubble of those years. Stallone started writing. He poured his anger, rejection, and unmet dreams onto the page late at night, lit only by borrowed lamps. He read all of Edgar Allan Poe's writings and learned how to transform suffering into poetry, and hopelessness into narrative. He wrote hundreds of pages of scripts, most of which were rejected, but each one paved the way for something bigger. He had learned something that would change his life in the future. He would write a role for himself if Hollywood would not give it to him. But before life gave him a chance, it had one last cruel thing to do to him. Stallone had to make a decision in the midst of his extreme poverty that was more devastating than receiving a rejection letter. Butkus, his bull mastiff, was his only friend, his best friend and the only animal that had never made fun of his face or laughed at his voice. Hunger, however, is ruthless. He sold Butkus for $40 outside a liquor store because he had no money left over for food or even for his dog. Stallone was devastated by the weight of a world that seemed determined to take everything away from him, and he stood crying as the stranger left with his beloved companion. Later on, he acknowledged that it was the darkest moment of his life. Nevertheless, he refused to give up even in that abyss. Every rejection, every humiliation, and every night of homelessness only strengthened his resolve. He held fast to the conviction that he was still alive, that the boy who was once written off as having a bleak future would forge a path that no one could ignore. He was propelled forward by the hunger that almost killed him. The loneliness that nearly broke him turned into the drive that kept him going. He was no longer the man made fun of at auditions or the kid made fun of in school. Now he was something else, a warrior, famished and scarred but unbreakable, and with pen in hand he was going to write the part that would not only save his life, but also leave his mark on movie history. His miracle did not come with privilege or good fortune. Hunger, humiliation, and a refusal to give up were the factors that forged it. Sylvester Stallone, then just 29 years old, Watched the underdog boxer Chuck Wepner fight Muhammad Ali to the end in a packed theater in 1975. A fire ignited inside him. He returned home to a small apartment and spent 3 restless days writing a script that reflected his hope and despair. Rocky emerged from that storm. Producers were so impressed by it that they immediately made him an offer of $350,000, which was a fortune for a man with only $16 in the bank and a wife who was expecting their first child. But everyone was taken aback by Stallone. He turned down the cash. He insisted on playing the lead despite the danger, saying later, "I couldn't live with that. If I sold the script and someone else played Rocky, I would have betrayed myself." When the studio finally gave in, the budget was cut to a meager $1 million. Guerrilla-style filming was used. Production stills were taken by his wife, Sasha. During the fight scenes, his father rang the bell. On the soundtrack, his brother sang. For himself, Stallone only made $35,000. Then the unthinkable occurred. Everything changed when Rocky debuted in theaters in 1976. It turned a man who had previously slept in bus stations into an overnight Hollywood star, earned 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and brought in over $225 million worldwide. But Rocky was more than the box office and awards. It was Stallone's own life story, with his soul portrayed in each frame as his hardships and injuries spilled onto the screen. But there are shackles attached to glory. Throughout the 1980s, Stallone transformed into the tortured veteran John Rambo, whose unbridled rage captivated audiences everywhere. When Rambo III swept the movie theaters in 1988, he was 42 years old and making one of Hollywood's highest salaries of $16 million per film. He became the ultimate action megastar at the same time that Rocky III and Rocky IV dominated the box office. But a man was pushing his body to the limit behind the headlines and posters. Rocky III starved himself until he had only 3% body fat left, which is so dangerous that doctors said it could kill him. He demanded that Dolph Lundgren hit him in person while filming Rocky IV. He spent 9 days in intensive care after the blow to his chest was so severe that it damaged his heart. Fans never witnessed the agony, the restless nights, or the surgeries, but they did witness steely muscles. Each frame of glory was made of blood and flesh. Then Hollywood dismisses him as fast as it installs a king. The 1990s were cruel. The failures of Judge Dredd, Oscar, and Or My Mom Will Shoot were ridiculed by critics and disregarded by viewers. The cheers that used to fill theaters had vanished. For Copland, 1997, Stallone put on one of his strongest performances, gaining 40 pounds at the age of 51. Award rumors circulated among critics, but Hollywood had already abandoned the project. The 1980s megastar was abruptly labeled a relic and abandoned to fend for himself in a field that didn't have room for him. One critic commented, "It was as if Rocky himself had finally been counted out." It felt real, too. The lights went out, the roles disappeared, and the silence was overwhelming for almost 10 years. However, surrender was never a part of Stallone's life. He wrote, directed, and embodied the fighter who refused to die in Rocky Balboa, 2006. His return at age 60 in 2010, he brought together the action legends in The Expendables, demonstrating to a new generation that he was still a king among warriors. 2 years later, he roared back as Rambo in the brutally raw Rambo IV. It was more than just a return. Resurrection was the event. Stallone had taken the blows, fallen to the ground, and gotten back up when no one thought he could, just like Rocky himself. His fire never went out, even as the years went by and he grew older. He passed the torch in 2015 at the age of 69 with Creed, where he received another Oscar nomination and moved millions with his portrayal of a gentle, vulnerable Rocky. He reinvented himself again in 2023 with Tulsa King, bringing the same presence that once dominated theaters to television. In the same year, the family Stallone exposed the man behind the legend, a father, a husband, and more than just an icon, revealing his soul. Stallone was still standing, scarred, older but unbroken, almost 50 years after Rocky. His name was now engraved into the very fabric of film, not just in the annals of Hollywood history. And the truth he had always known, that it's never about how hard you can hit, but how hard you can get hit and keep going, was whispered to the world by his journey, which was marked by both pain and victory. Hollywood's lights may shine brightly, but beneath them is a darkness that is much darker than any criticism or waning cheers. That darkness did not wait on the set for Sylvester Stallone. At home it waited, He was fighting an even bigger battle just as his career was taking off, one that no director could reshoot, no script could rewrite, and no audience could ever predict. Long before Rocky Balboa's name was heard in movie theaters in 1974, Stallone wed Sasha Tsak, a young actress and photographer whose faith in him was stronger than his own. Standing by his side when he was broke, unknown, and scrawling screenplays on scraps of paper in the dim light of a lamp, she was his bulwark in the storm of obscurity. Together, they created a brittle world that was held together by hope. Watered-down coffee cups to last through mornings, sandwiches that have been cut in half to serve 2 meals. Their hunger was overshadowed by laughter. Despite having little, they loved a lot. When almost no one else had faith in him, Sasha did. And she was there, camera in hand, documenting the miracle that forever altered their lives when Rocky was finally born in 1976. For a brief instant, it appeared as though fate had finally favored them. The hungry artist who became famous overnight, his loyal wife by his side, and now the prospect of a family to round out the picture. That same year, their first son, Sage Moonblood Stallone, arrived. Cradling his newborn son was a far bigger victory for Stallone than any golden statue. "Holding my son was bigger than holding a trophy," he would later remark. This was life. This actually happened. While Rocky represented his triumph on screen, Sage represented his triumph in real life, demonstrating that hope could blossom despite years of adversity. Stallone claimed that when Sage smiled for the first time, it was as if the world had restored all of his dreams that he had previously believed were gone. Sergio, their second son, was born in 1979, 3 years later. Additionally, the Stallones appeared invincible to the outside world. Notoriety, wealth, and 2 handsome boys. Sasha exuded quiet pride in interviews, stating that she felt nothing in the world could ever touch her kids. The photo appeared flawless, almost too flawless, as if life were preparing them for a cruel turn of events. Then, with ruthless accuracy, fate struck. Little Sergio received an autism diagnosis shortly after that. What ought to have been a time of happiness turned into one filled with incessant hospital stays, restless nights, and the gloomy silence of unsolved questions. Sasha's days turned into a routine of therapy sessions, silent prayers, and sobbing into pillows. The sound of her son's struggles filled the house more often than laughter after long nights of caregiving. Although Stallone's suffering was different, it was still intolerable. He is being pulled in 2 different directions by the unrelenting roar of Hollywood and the frail cries of his family. "I felt torn apart," he would later admit. "I was a hero on screen. I felt helpless at home. Like cracks in glass, the fracture spread. The daily heartache of raising a child whose future would never be straightforward was the heaviest burden Sasha bore in silence. Every therapy session where his chair was empty, every bedtime story he never told, every missed appointment, all of it made Stallone feel so guilty. He appeared to the world as a steel-carved action hero. Sasha saw him as a husband who was vanishing, engulfed by flashing cameras and movie sets. "The world may have gained a star, but I felt I was losing my partner," she once told a friend. 11 years into their marriage, the fairy tale had fallen apart by 1985. Their love was still there, but it was too weak to bear the crushing weight of exhaustion, illness, and celebrity. The divorce was announced in silence, not with a shout, the kind that stays in rooms long after people have finished speaking. It was more than just a marriage ending. It was a family being shattered, a scar that both parties bore for years, not in the news but in the voids where laughter once existed. It was a more brutal lesson for Stallone than any blow he had ever received in the ring. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against an opponent, but against the silence of a home where love has been smothered by sorrow. The news that made headlines in July 2012 was too harsh for any parent to handle, and it was the most devastating blow to Stallone's life. Sage Moonblood Stallone, his firstborn son, was no longer with him. His life was taken in his youth, his heart failing unexpectedly at the age of 36. For Stallone, it was more than just tragedy. It was a spiritual collapse, a wound more profound than any scar from surgery, stunts, or fists. His voice broke with grief as he whispered, "There is no greater pain than losing a child. It stays with you forever." The baby he once clutched in his shaking hands, the boy whose laughter used to fill his house. In Rocky IV, the young man who proudly stood next to him. It all fell silent in a moment. What had once brought him the most happiness now merely echoed hollowly in deserted rooms. A cruel reminder that even the most resilient fathers cannot prevail in some battles. The promise Sage held but never kept was what made the loss intolerable. In addition to acting, he had inherited his father's passion for movies and was able to direct, create, and forge his own career outside of Rocky's shadow. He aspired to become a well-known artist in his own right as well as Stallone's son, to tell tales that would outlive him. His future was glimmering like light on the horizon, and he had already started that journey with independent projects. Death, however, ripped the film from the projector before it could ever play, cutting the reel too short. For Stallone, it seemed as though a whole narrative, one he had longed to see come to life, had been ripped to black, leaving only silence where genius ought to have blossomed. Sasha experienced the same destruction. Their children, the laughter that used to fill their home, and now a grief too great to put into words, held them together forever, even though decades had passed since their marriage ended. They weren't estranged partners or former lovers at the funeral. They were just a mother and a father, standing silently next to each other, crushed under the most bizarre reversal of life itself. It was indescribable to watch the elderly bury the young, to bury the very child they had raised with shaking hands. Words exist for widows and orphans, but not for parents who have to bury their child, because the pain is too intense for words to express. Stallone's marriage to Sasha had brought him both his greatest blessings and his greatest tragedies. From Sergio's naive laughter to Sage's first sobs, from the frail happiness of family to the oppressive burden of diagnosis and death, theirs was a chapter written in the red ink of sacrifice and grief rather than Hollywood gold. This was the one battle Stallone could not win, the one script that no amount of rewriting could ever save for the man who had risen from obscurity, who had built an empire on tenacity, and who had personified the motto of never staying down. Thus, when the credits rolled on that phase of his life, what was left was a funeral of devotion and destruction, rather than a tale of love and divorce. The scars persisted in the photos of a son who ought to have grown up, in the empty room where Sage's laughter should have remained, in the quiet of family dinners where a chair would always be empty. For Sylvester Stallone, a man forged in steel by a lifetime of combat, this was the blow that broke more deeply than flesh and legend, a wound etched into his very being that would reverberate inside him for the rest of his days. Stallone's quest for love continued even after his first marriage ended quietly. Rather, it veered into a chapter as dangerous and brilliant as any Hollywood screenplay. At the height of his popularity with Rocky IV and Rambo, First Blood Part 2, in December 1985, he wed Brigitte Nielsen, a Danish actress and model. To the outside world, it looked like a match made for the silver screen. Walking the red carpet together are two powerful, charismatic, and statuesque figures that look like they belong on a movie poster. They were hailed by the media as the 1980s ultimate power couple. Millions of people thought they were watching a contemporary fairy tale as cameras flashed and headlines screamed. However, the reality behind the photos was much more precarious. Unlike his first marriage, their relationship was fueled by passion that was too intense to endure, rather than being tempered by quiet struggle and loyalty. Brigitte was lightning, brilliant and exciting, but unpredictable and impossible to hold without risk, whereas Sasha had been the steady anchor in his storms. Their differences in temperament soon became apparent to the general public. Tabloids used arguments that ought to have stayed private as fodder. In magazines, there were constant rumors of mistrust, incompatibility, and jealousy. What should have been a safe haven for two people became instead a stage with the world as their audience, and every misstep magnified under the spotlight. The marriage broke down nearly as soon as it started. It ended in divorce in 1987, barely 2 years later. While the media characterized it as an error that damaged Stallone's meticulously cultivated reputation, Nielsen herself would later admit that they had jumped into it too quickly. For a man who had survived poverty, rejection, and the brutality of Hollywood, this was a different kind of blow. It was a battle lost in front of millions, not one waged in solitude or on desolate streets. His once uplifting fame had now turned cruel, magnifying his personal injuries into a public spectacle. Stallone, looking back, admitted the union had been impulsive, a decision made in the whirlwind of success rather than in the calm of reflection. It had its own sting, but it wasn't the heartbreaking destruction of losing a child. The weight of lessons learned too late, the sting of public mockery, the reminder that passion is insufficient to meet life's demands. Although his marriage to Brigitte Nielsen was short in the lengthy plot of his story, It served as a warning that even legendary figures can make mistakes when they mistake love for fate. It was founded on Stallone himself, a man who pushed for the truth no matter what and left wounds on his body and soul that would never completely go away. The filming of Rocky IV in 1985 was the tipping point. Stallone was so fixated on authenticity that he forced his co-star Dolph Lundgren to strike him like it was actual combat. With the force of a hammer, one vicious blow slammed his heart against his ribs in his chest. Hours later, he passed out, his vision fading, his breath shallow and sharp. His condition was later likened by doctors to that of a victim of a high-speed car crash, with a bruised pericardial sac and a battered and swollen heart lining. He lay in critical care for 9 days, his life and career on a precarious cliff. "I thought I was finished," Stallone remembered. "I wasn't playing Rocky for the first time. I was fighting for my life." However, this was just one act in a lengthy tragedy that was inscribed on his body. For Rocky III in 1982, 3 years prior, Stallone had nearly starved himself to an unachievable 3% body fat. His organs could shut down at any time, according to the doctors. He acknowledged, "I wanted to look like a machine, but inside I was falling apart." His body was used as a weapon and a victim 6 days a week, sometimes 3 training sessions a day. On set, he passed out from dehydration. Obsession strained his kidneys. A new wound appeared every 10 years, a fractured neck that needed metal plates to keep him together, ribs that cracked under pressure, torn shoulders that made his arms shake. Over 14 major surgeries were performed to put his life back on track. Stallone's smile was hollow as he remarked, "They used to stitch up boxers after fights. That's what my life turned into, one lengthy repair job." However, the scars weren't just external. The silent war that was never captured on camera. He had to crawl out of bed in the mornings when his back locked so tightly, the nights when his spine ached like hell, the silent dependence on painkillers to survive another day. Supporters watched as the hero defied death and the warrior charged into battle. They never saw the man sitting by himself in the dark with his head in his hands, contemplating how many battles his body had yet to endure and whether the cost of his greatness had been too great. The toll could no longer be concealed by the 2000s. Tabloids were filled with rumors of poorly performed cosmetic surgery, and critics were analyzing every scar and line on his face. However, the reality was more brutal and humane. Stallone had undergone surgery in the early 1990s to repair nerve damage that had persisted since birth, the same cruel injury that had paralyzed a portion of his face and given him his slurred voice and crooked smile. What the world derided as ego was actually just another personal struggle for self-respect. Every scar on his face, the very canvas of his legend, had turned into a battleground of miscommunication, with no headline daring to tell it. Even though Stallone is 79 years old, he still moves in a different way. The steps are more cautious, the repetitions are slower, and the iron is lighter. But the fire is still burning brightly. His discipline is as keen as it was when he was younger. His diet is still austere, and his mornings still start with perspiration. The pain doesn't go away, he acknowledged, but neither does the will to keep moving. He no longer conceals the scars of aging or the scars of survival, whether he is on screen in Tulsa King or at home in The Family Stallone. As evidence that survival itself is a kind of heroism, he instead proudly wears them as medals rather than as a source of shame. Although cruel, the irony is incredibly poetic. Rambo and Rocky were portrayed as unbreakable, immortal men who could never fall. However, the man who saved their lives was left scarred, broken, and pieced back together. And maybe that's why people are still moved by his story. Since real heroes aren't made of steel, pain molds them, suffering reshapes them, and resiliency rebirths them. Stallone gave his face, his bones, his flesh to the film industry, and in doing so he turned suffering into history. And now one truth is more evident than ever as age deforms his body, and each scar silently testifies to it. The world never thought Sylvester Stallone would be an untouchable giant. Something greater, something rarer has always been him. A man who demonstrated that the spirit can rise and continue to rise until the very end, even when the body fails. At 79, Sylvester Stallone is no longer the untouchable titan of the box office, but rather a man who has endured hardship and come out on the other side with wisdom and scars. His fortune, which has been accumulated over decades of toil, sacrifice, and an unwavering will to persevere, now exceeds $400 million. However, Stallone himself frequently reminds everyone that the real prize was never money. Nevertheless, the tangible evidence of his rise from poverty to wealth is astounding. He lives in a $35 million oceanfront mansion in Palm Beach, Florida, with Jennifer Flavin, the woman who became his ray of hope after decades of storms. The mansion is a haven of marble, glass, and sunlight, with waves crashing just beyond the terrace. Stallone is reminded of how far he has come from the bus stops and borrowed couches of his youth by this estate, which is not only a symbol of luxury, but also of permanence. His influence extends well beyond Florida. In order to give his daughters Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett the stability he was never able to experience as a child, he spent almost $25 million on a sprawling Hamptons retreat. He made a lasting impression in Los Angeles when he sold Adele his renowned Beverly Hills compound, which had served as his creative stronghold, for an unprecedented $58 million. He once fought eviction notices and now owns some of the most valuable properties in America, as evidenced by another of his estates in Hidden Hills, California. Every home is more than just a place to live. It's a turning point, a chapter in the tale of survival that ends in victory. His garage reads like a power and velocity museum. Lamborghinis and Ferraris sit next to each other, while Bentleys and Rolls-Royces shine in the bright lights. European precision machines are lined up with American muscle cars and vintage Corvettes, and like steel steeds, Harley-Davidson motorcycles stand ready. He has flown in private jets, which are both a luxury and a tool for work. However, he frequently maintains that the laughter that permeates his house is what truly brings him joy, not horsepower or speed. He once thought, the cars, the houses, the fame, they're not my trophies. My daughters are. His final act now revolves around his family life. His wife of over 25 years, Jennifer, has supported him during his efforts at reconciliation and rejuvenation. Together, they have constructed a house that prioritizes stability over chandeliers. His oldest child, Sophia, was born with a tender heart but has since grown into a composed, well-spoken lady who is frequently referred to as Stallone's closest confidant. Scarlett, the youngest, is pursuing her own career in acting and sports, while Sistine has made a name for herself in modeling and podcasting. According to Stallone, their success is determined by the depth of their relationship at the dinner table and the laughter that reverberates through their home's hallways, not by magazine covers or awards. Even when it comes to legacy, Stallone is methodical. According to reports, he has started formalizing his estate plans, including a will and trusts that are carefully drafted to safeguard Jennifer and their daughters. This ensures that the wealth amassed over decades of on- and off-screen conflict will serve as a foundation rather than a burden. The idea of sacrificing everything for his family is a victory in and of itself for a man who once had nothing. It is a last act of duty and love. Stallone has created a stronghold of meaning and memory in addition to wealth. From Palm Beach's oceanfront walls to the vaulted garages crammed with roaring machinery, from the houses guarded for his daughters to the legacy written in law and paper, his current life is more than simply living comfortably. It's about showing that even the boy who was once ridiculed, shattered, and abandoned could rise to build a strong, loving, and lasting world. However, these triumphant symbols came at a terrible price. Audiences no longer think that Stallone's body is indestructible. He has endured 14 surgeries, leaving scars on his shoulders, ribs, and spine that resemble a map of all the battles he has fought for the film industry. His mornings now start with the creak of bones, the stiffness of joints, and the gradual ritual of cautious stretches rather than the clang of heavy iron. He walks slowly, ties resistance bands with shaking hands, and inhales deeply as if to draw strength from the atmosphere itself. His ruthless workouts have been replaced by more gentle ones. The anger has subsided, but the discipline is still there. He only eats vegetables, water, lean proteins, and other necessities. The scars are more visible than ever in the mirror. The muscles have weakened and the hair has turned silver. He admitted, "The pain doesn't go away, but neither does the will to keep moving." His words, which are not movie lines but rather the hard-won truth of a man who has lived it, speak to millions of people who wake up every morning to face their own struggles with age and pain. And his heart returns the favor even as his body bears the expense. At the Power of Love Gala in 2025, Stallone gave $1 million to the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health to support research. He has donated $100,000 to the Canadian Diabetes Association and supported epilepsy research, children's hospitals, and veterans. He put Rocky and Rambo memorabilia up for auction to transform nostalgia into healing, not to make money. The man who once had to sell his dog to make ends meet now uses philanthropy to complete the circle. Evidence that the lives saved by generosity, not box office receipts, are the true measure of legacy. However, shadows still exist even in the midst of wealth, charity, and family. Sage's absence lingers like a silence that cannot be broken by cheers or repaired by surgery. His eyes are still marked by the hardships of raising Sergio, the treacheries, and the long, painful nights. However, Stallone has found atonement in Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett's laughter. They restored to him the fragments of a heart that had been broken too often, demonstrating that happiness can grow even in grief-sown fields. Although cruel, the irony is incredibly human. Although Rocky and Rambo were depicted as immortal, the man who gave them life continues to walk with pain at every turn, and perhaps that's why his tale lives on. Heroes aren't made of steel. They are defined by endurance, forged in pain and rebuilt in love. Even though he is 79 years old and his body is weakened by age, his spirit is unwavering. Sylvester Stallone was never the unbeatable movie star. He is more uncommon. Living evidence that the spirit can continue to rise even when the body sags, the heart breaks, and the world rejects you. Leave a heart in the comments if you think Stallone's journey is more than just a movie. It's the tale of human strength. And homage to a man who transformed suffering into immortality and pain into legacy.